Today we're going to continue building the arts and crafts nightstand that is styled after some of this beautiful Stickley arts and craft furniture. We're going to try to build one similar to this. The first thing I like to do is select the wood. In fact, wood selection is one of the most fun parts of doing the project, I think. So we're going to look at some wood and see how to find the grain that gives you the best arts and crafts style patterning. The wood that we're going to use is quarter sawn white oak, and what we're looking for in the wood is this ray pattern that you can see here cutting across the grain. And this ray pattern is very characteristic of arts and crafts furniture, and so we'll look for boards that have as much of that pattern as we can find. Let me get a little closer picture of it. This board is kind of roughly finished, but you can see the grain that crosses, or the pattern that crosses it across. This is the ring grain growth, and this is the ray fleck pattern that we're looking for. Now this is only found in quarter sawn boards, and if we look at the end grain, you can see how the growth rings running straight across the board at largely a 90-degree angle to the surface of the wood. Now the structure that makes these ray flecks is this line. See these lines going across almost 90 degrees to the grain direction? So if I can get a little closer, you can see the rays crossing the board in this direction. Notice how when the board is sawn, some of these rays will be cut and exposed on the surface of the board. See where that one is cut right there? As those rays are exposed on the surface of the board, you get that desirable ray fleck pattern that you can see on the wood right there. This is what we're going to look for. We're looking for boards that have the most of that type of pattern that we can find. Looking for these boards, I think, is part of the fun of the project, and you'll go through many boards in a stack of lumber to find a few that are quarter sawn and giving you a good ray fleck pattern. Even when you have a stack of reportedly quarter sawn wood, most of it will not have a good pattern. So we'll examine some boards in the rough state to see how you can find this pattern. This first board we'll look at is a rough sawn board. You can see the texture is still rough, and it has not been planed, but you can already see the ray fleck pattern on the board. This one was quite distinct. Sometimes the pattern is not quite as distinct, and usually when I go to the wood yard, I'll take with me a small hand plane, maybe a spray bottle with some water in it, and I may have to wet the board at times, or scrape off some of the roughness on the outside with the plane to get the best view of this ray fleck. But this board, this was one of the best boards I think I've found that was easy to recognize in the rough state. And each board will have more or less of this ray fleck pattern on it. It may not extend the full length of the board. This board, you notice the pattern is changing now as we go down the board, and it's got a good pattern throughout the board. As I said, this is one of the best ones I've found. They're harder and harder to find, it seems to me, in the wood stores these days. Now, the next way I find the board, one supplier I go to will skip plane the boards, which makes it a little easier to recognize the grain. This next board has already been skip planed. In other words, he took a light cut across the board, and you can see the grain structure. Right here you notice the ray structure of the grain, and this makes it easier to recognize the structure on the board. Now here's a board right next to it. I bought it at the same time, and you notice it has very little of the ray pattern. There's a little bit right there, but a lot of this is just straight grain. So sometimes I end up buying a board and just using just for one end of the board. You can see this end of the board, well, that's not showing up very well, but it has much more of the grain pattern. So selection and finding these boards is a real challenge, and but I think it's part of the fun. You'll also notice that the wood comes in different colors. This board here has a light tannish color, kind of almost more yellow cast to it, which is my preferred color of wood. This board has much more of a, I consider it a gray undertone to it, and more of the wood I've found now is this color, and I haven't been able to find wood quite this color now. I like this color better because it stains more. When it stains, it has more of a clear grain pattern on it. Some of these grayish boards, the grain pattern is less distinct and a little bit muddy, and the board overall comes out a darker color when you stain it. So color and matching color is an important challenge when you're building a piece.